First question, a fun one. Approximately how much US currency exists per American adult? So assuming that if we took the currency, divided amongst each of us, how much is there? And again, this is not like bank account money. Like these are actual, how many bills are there? Answer here is C. So it's about 5,500 bucks per person. I don't have $5,500 in cash right now. Probably most of you don't. So there's sort of it's an odd fact because like not many people carry that much money. So where is it? Well, over half of the dollars circulate outside the US. So people in other countries keep US currency. It's a pretty stable asset. It's something they think is going to be safe and not lose its value. For most people, it's not a good way to hold wealth, right? You don't earn interest on it. There's inflation, which makes your purchasing power of your money go down. It also can be lost, damaged, or stolen. A lot of it is probably held by criminals. So if you ever see Ozark, they talk a lot about how they're taking like cash from illegal operations and trying to turn them into money that's cleaner, that you can actually spend on things you can put in the bank without getting caught. One interesting note I found when I was reading about this is that people in Japan tend to hold a lot of cash. And if you think about when we talked about the drawbacks, Japan doesn't really have some of those. So Japan has historically had very low inflation. So by not having your money in the bank, you're not really seeing inflation, your money lose a lot of value to inflation. And it's also had very low crime, so you're less likely to have your money stolen. Next thing, I got a couple of slides that are more informative, just for his background, and not that like there's some facts in here that I'm never going to ask you on an exam. So we think when we're answering this question, how much money is there? We want to think about what counts as money, right? So we know that the $5,500 per person in cash is that counts as money. But I don't have all my money in cash right now. I probably actually have $0 in cash other than change in the car. But I do still have money in a bank account. And it seems like that should probably count, right? Because if I want to go buy groceries, it shouldn't make that much of a difference if I pay for them with cash or if I pay for them with my debit card, which just deducts money from my bank account. Well, what we want to think about is the example of my debit card or my cash. We want to think about those are examples of things that are liquid. How easy is it to turn an asset into cash? Well, if you have cash, it's the most liquid asset. It's already cash. And if you have something like money in a checking account, you can immediately write a check or use your debit card and spend that money and turn it into cash, buy whatever you want to with it. So there's these terms M1 and M2. So if you follow things like macroeconomics or finance things, when you hear about the money supply, these are terms you'll hear. And they're just different ways of defining the money supply. So M1 is the most narrow definition of money. It includes things that are very easy to spend. So cash, traveler's checks, checking accounts. So again, cash, obviously you can spend right away. Checking accounts, use your debit card. You can write someone a check and you can spend that very easily. Traveler's checks, hardly anybody uses anymore, but that's one of the examples. It was like if you're going on vacation, you could get the bank to issue you these traveler's checks. And so instead of carrying around $500 in cash that you're worried might get stolen, you have these pieces of paper and you show some ID and sign them at the restaurant, and then the restaurant accepts them as cash. I think that was generally how it worked. And these are things that are very liquid. So you might hear the term high liquidity. M2 includes everything in M1 and some things that take a little more time to get access to. So things like savings accounts, et cetera. So you generally can't write a check from your savings account, but if you want money from it, you have access to it. And it's a tiny bit less liquid. To be clear. Further information is unimportant for this class. There's also an M3 that we don't need to worry about. So these are just, again, background overviews so that if you hear the terms, you'll have some familiarity with them. All right. Next fun question that we're definitely not going to cheat on. What phrase is covered up on that part of the dollar bill? So the answer here is B, a Federal Reserve note. That is going to bring us to talking about the Fed. So the Federal Reserve is the organization in charge of money, which is why they get to put their name on all of it. So the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed. So the Federal Reserve System consists of 12 member banks. And again, background info, I'm never going to ask you how many banks there are, ask you to name them. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors oversees the Federal Reserve System. And the Fed is the central bank of the United States. That's the main thing you need to know from this. And this is necessary when you use fiat money. You need to have some central bank because, again, fiat money is what we talked about, the US dollar being where it's not backed by gold, it's just backed by the US government. And so when you're doing that, you control how much money there is, right? If you're using gold, the central government doesn't control how much gold is in the world. But with fiat money, the Fed is going to decide how much money should be there. And so there's two main jobs for the Fed. First is to manage the money supply. And second is to regulate banks. And we're going to see how those things go hand in hand, how by regulating banks, that's going to allow them to manage the money supply. And by manage, what we really mean is the number of dollars. Okay. Here's a little more background info. We're going to learn about the There we go. The money supply is overseen by the Federal Open Market Committee, which is overseen by the Board of Governors. So when you hear about when the Fed meets, when they talk about what they're going to do for targeting interest rates, this is who we're talking about is the Board of Governors. So there are 7 members are appointed by the president and approved by Congress. They have 14-year terms. So the current chair of the Fed, so we want me to go back, is Jerome Powell. And he is in charge of the Board of Governors. So I want to see this slide again. And we keep going. So the most important job of this Open Market Committee is to manage the money supply. So does that mean they just print more money? And the money supply, well, the money supply also includes money in bank accounts, which means that we don't necessarily need to print more money, right? If the money supply includes money in your checking account, maybe there's some way we could sort of adjust the money that's in bank accounts, something along those lines. Banks are regulated by the Fed, and these regulations can affect the money supply. So maybe there's some way that the Fed bank regulations can have something to do with like the amount of money in bank accounts or some way, think about some way that they can affect the money supply. And that's what we're going to learn about soon. So we're going to start off with an example of, people are probably still writing. We're going to start off with an example of a bank. And we're going to start very simple. We're going to start off with a world with no banks. And we have our world has $100 in currency, all in cash, which means that no banks, so we're all just carrying our money around. And if I want to buy a gallon of milk, I give someone $3, and the grocery store now has my $3, and they can spend it as they wish, and so on. And so the first bank is founded, and it's First National Bank. I think I've called it First Michigan Bank in the workbook, maybe. And this bank accepts deposits, but doesn't offer any loans. So what that is I started a bank, and I got a building, I got a big safe inside of it, I got a guy standing outside guarding the money, and all I'm there for is to keep your money safe. So you go, you give me $5, I keep your $5. You come and ask for it later, and you say, "Give me my $5 back," and I give it to you, and you say, "Thanks for keeping it safe." Well, this is saying that all deposits are held as reserves. So the deposits, that's the money you gave me to keep safe. Reserves are money a bank has on hand. So that's money in the vault as opposed to money it is loaned out. So for now, there's no money being loaned out. So all the money you give me, I just hold in cash. This is known as 100% reserve banking because 100% of the money deposited is held as reserves. And for now, we're going to suppose that all $100 is deposited in the bank. So I start the bank, everyone loves it, and so they all put all their money there. So we're going to pause here. And with this example, we're just going to pause for a few slides because we're going to have to start talking about a balance sheet. And probably a lot of us have never seen a balance sheet. I actually did not learn about this when I was an undergrad, so I had not seen one, or in grad school, so I had not seen one until I was working in bank regulation. So I want to give us a brief overview of a balance sheet, and we're going to sort of start off with more of a silly example, not thinking about a bank, but just thinking about you. And the two important terms we have are assets and liabilities. Assets, we just think of that's what you have. So whatever you have, that's an asset. Whatever you owe someone else is a liability. And for now, we will assume assets equal liabilities. So let's say you borrow $20 from your dad for gasoline. Well, we could draw your balance sheet. We're going to say you start off without any money. And so all this is the only thing you've done. You now have assets, the $20 bill your dad loaned you. Your liabilities are that you owe your dad $20, right? If your dad shows up and says, all right, I need my $20, you got to figure out a way to pay him. And you could take this asset you have as cash, and you could turn it into another asset. You could turn it into that gasoline. So now you have $20 in gasoline and owe your dad $20. Okay, so that was one thing you did with your $20. So you could go buy something with it. Another thing that you could do is you can take those $20. Instead of buying gasoline, you could have put the money in the bank. So you ask your dad to borrow money, you take the money he loaned you and just put it in the bank yourself. Well, this is actually loaning money to a bank. So you may not have thought that, that when you go to the bank and put money in the bank, you're loaning the bank money, but you are, because that's your money. You can come back and get it if you want it, but right now they have it, and you're letting the bank do what they want to with it. So you've loaned them money. Well, what the bank gave you was an IOU $20 note. And so it used to be that you would, I remember I physically had this sort of, it kind of looked like a checkbook. And when you went to the bank, they would give you a stamp saying how much money you had. This makes me seem really old. It was just not that long ago. I'm sure it was electronic somewhere, but I had a physical, I think they called it a passbook. Anyway, and so that book thing entitled you to the money that it said was in your account. So the bank gave you a note that said, all right, you have to give this guy $20 if he comes back and asks for it. Well, that note you have is an asset. So that your bank account is an asset for you, because even though you don't physically have the cash, you have the right to go to the bank and ask for it. So that note from them, that IOU that they gave you, is an asset. All right, so back to our balance sheet. Now, all right, so again, these bullet points we've already seen, assets and liabilities. Assets, for now we have assets equal to liabilities. So we borrowed $20 from dad. The first thing I could have done was buy gasoline. The second thing I could do is put it in the bank. Well, if I'm loaning it to the bank, I could also loan it to a friend. And so now my balance sheet would look like this. My assets are the money I loaned to my friend, because my friend can go, I can go demand my $20 back from my friend. And I owe my dad $20, so that's a liability. So, and again, assets equals liabilities. Money I've loaned out is an asset. Money I owe someone is a liability. I remember thinking that was kind of a weird thing to think about when I first learned this, is that, like, I don't know, I feel like if I loan my friend $20, that kind of seems like a liability because they might not pay me back. But in terms of a balance sheet, that is an asset, because that's money that you had, that you should have, that you own the IOU. You own the right to ask for $20. So this next one, I'm not going to throw on top hat. We'll just go through it quickly. All right. You borrow $10 from your friend and proceed to make some interesting financial decisions. You use $5 to buy vape pods, $3 on lottery tickets, and you loan $2 to another friend. Which of the following represents all of your assets? And first off, if your friend wants $2, just give them $2. You're going to make your friend, like, you're going to keep harping on them to give you back those $2. The answer here is D. So all of those things are assets. The vape pods and lottery tickets you now own, and that $2 you're owed by your friend is an asset to you because again, you can go, tell your friend to give you $2. Yeah, apparently I undershot the estimate, my silly example of vape pods that apparently I'm not pricing the vape pods high enough. All right, so back to our bank example. So now we can think of our bank balance sheet. Well, the deposits are our bank's liabilities, right? So again, this is the money people gave my bank. I have to give them all IOUs, and if they ever come, I have to give them back their $100. So those are deposits, which are a liability. My assets are the reserves. And you remember, what are the reserves? That is the cash that I have in the vault. That's an asset. It's right there. If I ever want to go buy anything with it, I just open up the vault and spend the money. The supply of money is still $100. Now the bank just has it all. And so if the bank holds banks hold all the reserves, banks do not affect the money supply, right? There's still $100 in the economy. It just is the case that I hold all $100 as a bank. So money is sitting at First National Bank. The bank, if I'm the bank owner, I would like to loan it and earn interest, right? I've got this $100 sitting in the vault. There. I've got $100 sitting in the vault. And what do I think about that? What am I as a bank owner going to do? Well, I would like to loan it out and earn interest, right? Well, the bank's in the vault. I can't do anything. It's just there. Why not loan? Okay, why not loan 100% of it? I've got $100 there. I can loan out $100 or make some more interest. Maybe that's one way to do it. Well, the reason I can't do that is depositors eventually want to get their money out, right? So I don't want it to be the case that my customer says, all right, I need $3. I have to pay back my friend. And I say, oh, sorry, I don't have your $3. Kind of embarrassing. I'll let you know when I get it. Right? It's not going to work for a bank. So the bank has to keep money available for when someone goes and asks for their money out of the bank. So you have to keep some cash on hand and loan out the rest. So what we're doing here is I sort of get a sense of in an average day or month, how many people come in and ask for their money. So how much do I need to keep around? Well, when I keep some cash on hand and loan out the rest, that is known as fractional reserve banking. Let's say I decide to keep $10 on hand, loan the other $90 to one borrower. So I'm keeping 10% in reserves. That's the fraction I keep in reserves. And I'm loaning out the other $90 to one borrower. Michael Scott uses that $90 to buy a forklift. All right, now let's look at our balance sheet. So I still have those $100 in deposits, right? I still owe all my customers $100 if they want to come get their money back. And my reserves are $10. That's the money I still have in cash. And the other asset I have is that I can go ask for $90 back. So what's the money supply? Well, I've got there's $100 in deposits. Remember, we talked about whether it's M1 or M2. When you have this money in your bank account, that counts. You think of that as being as good as cash. You think of that as being money. Yes. So this is back to our bank. We're done with loaning money or borrowing money from dad. We're back to our First Michigan Bank. And so that $100, that counts as part of the money supply, because all the people who have the money there, they think of that as their own, right? I can go write a check to it right now and just, write someone a check and use the money that's in my bank account. So that counts as money, $100 in deposits. Well, in addition to that, Michael Scott is walking around with $90 now. And soon he's going to be giving that to the forklift company owner. And that forklift company owner now has $90. And he'll go spend some of that on a watch or on dinner. And so those are that's actual cash floating around the economy. So that counts as money. So notice now our money supplies, the $100 in deposits that everyone who's a bank customer has some of, and the $90 in borrowed money is cash, so that counts as money. So notice now our money supply is $190. So the money supply actually increased. This is sort of a little confusing because there's more money out there, it seems. The economy is more liquid, right? Michael was able to access $90, but we're not actually any richer. We don't have any more stuff. Our factory of a country is not producing anymore. There just happens to be more money around. I'll pause here for a second. It seems like some people are still writing. All right. Is this the class that was all going to pitch in to buy me the Bentley with the stars? All right. So what we got next is what we call application and review. So I mentioned that I was going to start doing these things. I think we've done them once or twice before, where we try to go back and stuff we've done previously and look at real questions from the news. And this is actually some stuff about COVID that was from the spring, and which is, I was writing the workbook around late spring, and so that is what we have. And so some of these are going to seem very prescient, and some of them will seem like they vastly underestimated what was going to happen. So this is something from JP Morgan's research. They now, this was, again, sometime back in February, I think, now sees the coronavirus outbreak as a material disruption for a global economy that is or was poised to accelerate this year. Even assuming the outbreak eases soon, and these negative demand and supply shocks fade, the near-term damage to China and spillovers to the rest of the world will be significant. No kidding. And they slashed their global GDP growth projection. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about the economic impact of the coronavirus outbreak. We'll use the aggregate expenditures model and our model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Almost all the following numbers are made up, just so you know. So this is an article. This was from late February. I think this was just starting to be most of us were just starting to hear about it, or at least starting to hear about it as something that could actually have an effect around the world. What I fear is you'll have people in the US actually beginning to change their behavior, to think, do I want to go to movies? Do I want to go to a sporting event? Do I want to sit in big crowds? These are all the areas where we want people to change their behavior now. People just begin to pull back on their willingness to be out there and spending. Can I rein in the chat a little bit, please, at least until we get to the top hat questions? So we're going to think about the effect of coronavirus on consumption. Let's suppose that fear of the virus leads people to spend less. And some of that is because we have fewer places to spend money. So we'll spend less on electronics because new iPhones are not available. This was one of the first impacts, was that when China went under a really strict lockdown, and that included the factories producing iPhones stopped making iPhones. Then definitely we've seen that people spend less on travel and at restaurants because they are afraid of getting infected. And this is something that's happened. And one of the things they've seen is that a lot of the changes in behavior were not driven by things being closed, but being forced to be closed, but just on individual behavior. So if you look, I think it was OpenTable. If you look at their like reservation data is that the restaurant reservation data went drastically down in places, even in the couple of days before the lockout, before the indoor dining was forced to be closed because people were on their own deciding not to do that. And the other reason we're going to see people spending less is that you're going to save more of your money in case there's a recession and you lose your job, or if you get sick and can't work. Initially, autonomous spending is $15,000 and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. The virus lowers marginal propensity to consume to 0.5. So again, less places for me to spend my money, and I'm scared and want to save up in case I lose my job. Suppose taxes are 1,000 and income is 51,000. How much does the reduction in the marginal propensity to consume reduce consumption? So what this problem really consists of is plugging numbers into this equation. We start off at our initial baseline, which is here. We have our autonomous spending of 15,000, disposable income of 50, and the marginal propensity to consume of 0.75. And the next thing that happened was we reduced our marginal propensity to consume. And notice, it's not like you lost your job or anything. You just decide, you kept the same income, you just decided to spend less of it. So marginal propensity to consume went down to 0.5. Well, now what we do is you just put all of this back into the equation. So 15,000 stays, 50,000 stays. All that changes is that this went from 0.75 to 0.5. So if we do the arithmetic, we started off, our consumption was 52,500, and then it changed to 40,000. $52,500 minus 40,000 is 12,500. The answer is C. All right, next question. Fears over the virus also lead businesses to reduce their capital investment by $1,000. How will this affect equilibrium GDP? All right, the answer here is C, and let's look at why. So this, if you remember, this one when Graham was teaching, this was one of the last slides, I believe, or at least one of the last slides of the aggregate expenditures. And this was really what's important. Like, you don't need to remember how we derived it. And because the exam's open book, you don't actually need to, and what you got to at the end was we were able to derive what equilibrium GDP is from all of these components. So the expenditure components, marginal propensity to consume, and taxes. And so what we have here is we had a change in income or investment. Sorry, we had a change in investment. And what happened to investment? How did that change GDP? Well, that change in investment was multiplied by the multiplier. And what does that mean? Well, this number right here is greater than 1, right? We talked about how this is the reduction in investment means Michael Scott didn't buy the forklift, which means the forklift operator couldn't buy a watch and didn't spend money on a watch. And the watch owner didn't spend money on a restaurant, and so on. So the multiplier serves to make a small change in investment have a big impact on GDP. Next, The reductions in consumption and investment mean that in the short run, GDP does what and the price level does what? GDP decreases and the price level decreases. And this relates to what we've learned about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So if we don't know where to start on one of these problems, this is a good place to begin. Now what we said is there's a reduction in consumption and investment. Those are both components of aggregate demand. So that means aggregate demand shifts to the left. But as we started off at point 1 and we moved to point 2. So what is the effect there? This right here is the price level. This is GDP. Price level went down and GDP went down. This is the effect of a reduction in aggregate demand. So this again, those are both only components of aggregate demand for now. This is just in the short run. You could think about in the long run, potentially the lack of investment could affect aggregate supply, but we want to think about in the short run, we're just thinking about the effect on demand. In the long run, maybe what happens, and hopefully what happens, is that the investments pick up and we kind of make up for it next year is one way to think of it. But for now, we're just thinking about it affecting aggregate demand. Okay, so the first paragraph, this is a lot of text. The first paragraph is basically a caveat. So if the virus actually has a major impact on the US economy, the long-run aggregate supply curve could shift in. Employees may not go to work, companies may not make necessary capital improvements, people aren't going to school, which has an impact on human capital. Both of these will reduce the actual amount of GDP the economy is able to supply. But we're going to assume that the long-run aggregate supply curve is unchanged. So after the decrease in GDP and prices discussed in the last slide, so we talked about with the aggregate demand shift affecting GDP and prices. In order to get the economy back to the long-run equilibrium, what will happen? So remember, what happened after this demand shift? GDP went down, which means we have higher unemployment. So if there's a lot of people out of work, how is that going to affect wages, GDP, or prices? So what's the most direct effect? How is that going to affect how is the fact that a lot of people are out of work going to affect one of those? And what do we expect it to lead to in the long run? Good. The answer here is that wages will fall. And so the reason is, let me go back and show you. So we are at this point where GDP is what we would call too low. So GDP is below the long run equilibrium, right? So we started in long run equilibrium, which meant aggregate demand equaled aggregate supply equaled long run aggregate supply. So you remember this right here, long run aggregate supply, this is where our economy is at full employment. So we have structural and frictional unemployment. We don't have any cyclical unemployment. Essentially, people are working as much as they can work in the long run. Factories all running full capacity. Then we shifted over to point 2 here. When that did, GDP went down, which means unemployment went up. So now we have all these people out of work. And once that happened, eventually, when wages are no longer sticky, when it's time for you to go in for your annual review and asking for a pay raise, well, then your boss can say, look, there's really high unemployment. There's lots of people out there who want jobs and can't get them. Our business isn't doing better, isn't doing well. You need to take a pay cut or else we're going to have to let you go. Which means that you take a pay cut. Your wage is a cost to a firm. It's just like if their electric bill went down. So this cost to the firm decreases. And that is going to be a shift to the right in aggregate supply, because now a firm's their supply costs went down. That's going to shift their supply to the right. So when we talked about determinants of supply, one of the things we talked about were resource costs. So what's that going to do? That is going to increase aggregate supply. And that should get us right back to our long run equilibrium. Because what happened was, again, we think that eventually the labor market should clear. So eventually wages will adjust so that everyone who wants a job will have one. And so there's not going to be a labor shortage or surplus. So when that happens, that means we're back to the point where we don't have any cyclical unemployment. All our factories are running at full capacity. And so we're back to our long run equilibrium GDP. And so if we look overall, what happened was, this was us pre-COVID, pre-recession, pre-decrease in aggregate demand. This is us afterwards. And so we're back to where we started in terms of GDP, and we now see a permanently decreased price level.